Hi everyone, Art Burns here, wishing you well today. I hope that you're having a great day, and I hope that you're able today to meet each moment with presence, acceptance, and compassion. Because to the extent that you are able to meet each moment with presence, acceptance, and compassion is the extent to which you're able to cultivate the conditions for happiness and for well being. And this is the well being in our physical health, our emotional health, and our mental health. And so today, though, I want to talk really specifically about that third essence, right? The essence of compassion, right? As we are able to practice compassion, most people look at compassion as something that is just, being a nice person, right? And of course that's involved with compassion, and that doesn't hurt to be a nice person, right? But that's only really just barely scratching the surface of what compassion really means. Compassion doesn't mean to be nice to the extent of the at our own expense, as it were, right? It doesn't mean to be soft. It doesn't mean to be complacent, right? Compassion is actually a very brave thing, and what it is more than just the ability to be nice to people or to be kind to people, which again is of course involved with compassion, but more so, what compassion is allowing ourselves to get out of ourselves and to build a connection to others. There's a really great teacher. His name is Sri Kumar Rao. He's a college professor, university professor, and he talks about the me-centered universe, right? And he has this really great story that he tells about Galileo having gotten himself into a spot of trouble way back when he had the audacity to suggest that the sun does not revolve around the earth, but rather that the earth revolves around the sun. And this is true, right? Galileo, I believe, waited until his deathbed before he made this announcement, right? Because he knew how much this was going to shake things up, and it certainly did, right? But Sri Kumar says that Galileo got it wrong. Despite what you've learned in school, Galileo was wrong. He says, in fact, the Earth does not revolve around the sun, but instead the Earth, the sun, and everything else in the universe revolves around me. Right? And that's the idea of this me-centered universe. And what Sri Kumar Rao is telling us there is that everything that we experience, right, we tend to put into the context of what is it doing to me? What does this mean to me? In fact, in this same lesson, Sri Kumar will tell us that let's say your spouse gets a new job, right? They come home and they say, "Hey, I just got this new promotion." The first thing we're likely to think is, "Well, what does this do to my life? Does this mean that my spouse is going to travel more? Does it mean they're going to work more hours? Or does it mean that I have to do anything different with my time? Is it going to affect our morning commute?" And this is just natural, right? This is just the way it happens to us, right? And it doesn't make us wrong to do this. In fact, it's really part of our primal survival instinct, right? That we need to know what's going to happen to us at any given moment, right? But of course, as you can imagine, this is a prime source of stress in our lives, right? Because as we're considering what is happening to us, and if we're considering the way things are happening to us rather than us fitting into the process of things that are happening, we tend to, engage in a level of fear, right? And any time, as you've watched if you've watched any of these videos or listened to this podcast before, or you've attended my stress reduction seminar on Sunday evenings, you'll know that stress is always caused by fear, right? And so when we engage in fear-based thoughts, even though they're technically good for us, right? Fear is technically something that is keeping us safe, right? Because as we express fear, in a primal sense, right, out in the wild, we're going to be trepid in how we're kind of like looking around a boulder in case there's an animal there, right? Like that's essentially on a primal level, fear is a good thing, right? But when it's an overload, when it's overdone, when it's an abundance of fear, that's when the stress response happens. Because what we're doing is we're thinking fear-based thoughts, right? And by thinking fear-based thoughts, our brain and our body don't know the difference between a thought and an actual experience of something that is going to hurt us. And therefore, we wind up with a physical response to a mental experience. And that's where we get into trouble. And that's where a lot of health issues come from, the stress response. That's where a lot of, just not optimizing ourselves in our lives to do the things that we want to do, comes from the stress response. So again, how does that relate now back to this sort of me-centered universe, right? Now, or what is, or how can getting out of that me-centered universe deal with this stress, right? So again, if we're constantly thinking, which we are, if we're instinctively thinking about what the external experiences we're having are going to affect ourselves, right? Then we're constantly coming back into ourselves, right? And then we're constantly sort of this is something that psychologists and neuroscientists would call selfing, right? And selfing, that brings up there's a certain circuit in our brain, right, that becomes active when we're not involved with a task-oriented activity. Okay, now, a side note, 95% of the activities that we have in our lives are non-task oriented activities. Okay, we're talking about the walking from our desk to the washroom. We're talking about washing dishes. We're talking about driving our car, right? Like, you don't think about driving your car, right? You've driven your car so many times that you just jump in and you go, right? Oftentimes you might get to where you're going and you can't even remember how you got there, right? Like, literally, you don't even remember making the turns. You don't even remember seeing the things that you normally see there. And it's like, wow, how did I even get here, right? Like, that happens to all of us, right? And so those are the non-task oriented activities that fill our lives. I mean, we're talking about 95% of our experiences are these kind of, non-task oriented activities. Anytime we're engaged in one of these many experiences, a certain part of our brain, this certain network of neurons in our brain becomes active. This network of neurons that I'm talking about is called the default mode network. Okay, and essentially what the default mode network does, two really important things in the context of what we're talking about here. The first thing it does is it gives us a sense of separate self. Now, even neuroscience, now this is not a spiritual concept, but even neuroscientists and psychologists will tell you that it's a false sense of separate self. Right now, the world's religions and spiritual, schools of thought will also very much tell you that this is a false sense of separate self. But it is not limited to the spiritual realm, right? In hard-nosed neuroscience, the accepted reality is that we are not separate from one another. We are very much connected to each other on a limbic, energetic level, right? So the first thing that is a kind of a faulty thing that the default mode network does is it gives us this sense that we are separate, right? That there's space in between what we're experiencing and whatever everybody else experiences, right? And that's not accurate, and that's not true. But this is what our brain, the default mode network has our brains believing, right? The second thing that this default mode network does for us is it engages us in this process of selfing. And this is a psychological term. And the idea is that we think about ourselves, okay? We think about ourselves in terms of the autobiographical self, right? Like how did I get to where I am? What is my life all about? Where am I going? Where have I been? What is happening to me? Again, me, right? Self-centered, me-centered universe, right? And so when we're selfing, okay, because of the way that our brains are wired, right? Our brains are wired always to be looking at the negative aspects of our lives, right? Because these are the aspects of our lives that could potentially hurt us, right? These are the ones that pose the danger, right? So therefore, when we are selfing, when we're thinking about ourselves in terms of what's happening in our lives, we are always going to be more likely to think about what's wrong with ourselves and wrong with our lives than we are to think about what is good about our lives, right? And so again, me. This is a very common theme here, right? And so the idea is that when we dwell in these things, so in other words, let me give you an example, right? You're driving your car and you're not really paying attention to where you're going because you don't have to, and you're not paying attention to what your body's doing because you don't have to, right? You're steering, you're hitting the brakes, you're hitting the blinkers, you're doing all this stuff very automatically, right? And so during this time, your mind is wandering somewhere, right? And most often it's going to wander to something that is, again, negative, right? So maybe you think about a bill that's due, or you think about just money issues in general, or maybe you think about health issues or concerns that you have about your health. You think about a social, issue or a romantic issue, any one of these things, right? And as you start thinking about these things, again, you think about what's wrong with them. You think about the problems that they pose. You don't think about, how awesome your financial life is. You don't think about how awesome your romantic life is or your social life. And you don't think about how unbelievably positive your health is. Normally speaking, when you're in this sort of, non-task oriented activity, you're going to think about the negative aspects of these things, right? And so, of course, once you start thinking about the negative aspects of these things, the mind then takes over. And the mind has a really, really great talent for telling stories and making up scenarios and coming up with these very vivid and detailed, very quickly coming up with these very vivid and detailed scenarios and stories about your life that are going to be negative, right? And kind of always gearing towards the worst case scenario. So if you're thinking about a health problem, you're thinking about how bad it is and how, you're going to get to a point where, you're going to be, you're going to convince yourself that you're very sick and you have, weeks to live, that kind of thing, right? And that's, of course, an extreme and very kind of silly example, but that's what the mind does, right? The mind takes us into these stories where we start to think about the worst case scenarios, right? So now where does compassion come into all this, right? We started talking about compassion. Well, I'm going to tell you. Remember what I said. Compassion is not just about being a nice person or being kind, even though that is very much part of being compassionate. Compassionate is wishing for the well-being of others. In fact, the word compassion, right, comes from the Latin cum passus, which means to suffer with, right? Passus is to suffer, cum is with, right? So the idea of compassion as we're practicing it means to suffer with. Now, what does that mean? That means that there's a connection, right? We're building a connection to others, right? We're doing that through just the desire and the wishing for the well-being of others, right? And this helps us to get out of, remember I told you about the false sense of separate self that happens with the default mode network, right? And remember I tell you about this me-centered universe, which is all connected to what we're talking about, right? The idea that we're always thinking about ourselves. Well, when we practice compassion and we do so deliberately and intentionally and regularly, what we do is we build the skill of getting out of ourselves. We build the skill of connecting to others rather than staying within ourselves, right? And what this does is this neutralizes the effect of that default mode network to have us thinking about ourselves and all the things that are wrong with ourselves and everything else. And what that also does is it allows us to lead with our heart, right? It allows us to lead with the understanding of the benefit of others, right? Which is something that is just fabulously important and fabulously profoundly beneficial for your health, your mental health, your emotional health, and your physical health, right? Let me give you an example. When you're leading with compassion, right? When you're truly leading yourself with compassion, you get into a traffic jam, right? And instead of thinking in this traffic jam, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening to me. This is the worst thing that could possibly happen to me. I have an appointment. I need to get through here. This is not fair to me, right? Instead of all that, right, which is ultimately going to result in that stress, right? Because as soon as we feel like this is happening to us, we feel attacked, right? And as soon as we feel attacked, that's when we're going to start making up these stories about how bad this is going to turn out. And once we're thinking about how bad it's going to turn out, that's when we're in the stress response, right? So instead, when we're leading ourselves with compassion, what we're going to do is we're going to think more in terms of, gosh, I wonder what the cause of this is. I hope nobody got hurt. I hope at the front of all this traffic, it's somebody who just, I hope it was just a flat tire or something. I hope nobody actually got hurt. Right. And so that might seem like a very insignificant thing. And again, it might seem like we're just being nice or being caring for others. But science and all the data and all the research out there shows that by engaging in that thought process, right, what we're doing again is we're getting outside of our own mind and outside of our own sort of me-centered universe. And in doing so, we're going to feel a connection to others. And in feeling that connection to others, we will reduce the stress in our bodies, right? And in reducing the stress in our bodies, we're going to now prime ourselves to do the things in our lives that we want to do and to live life on our terms, right? And this could not be more important in whatever aspect of life you're talking about. As a parent, as just a person in the world, it doesn't matter. It's going to benefit you. So there's some very simple practices that you can do to develop compassion. It really is. There's just some very simple, regular practices. If you do them regularly, you will develop this sort of habit of being more compassionate. And I would love to teach you some of these practices. So if you'd like to learn and you're curious about what all this means and you'd like to know more about it, hit up a comment. Okay, just drop a comment below, send me a direct message, reply to this email, go to my website, artburnscoaching.com, book you can contact me through there, either book a time to actually talk or send me an email, whatever it works for you. Okay, but I would love to be able to help you to learn some of these very simple practices because they're so simple and they're so easy to incorporate in your life. And within a matter of weeks, you'll be amazed at how good it feels and the benefits to yourself, to your life, to your benefit, to your health, to your relationships, all of it, all of it. All right, folks, thanks for listening. I'll be back again tomorrow talking about self-compassion, which ironically has nothing to do with the me-centered universe, but it's about showing ourselves this compassion too and how powerful this is going to be. Thanks for listening. I hope you get to check it out tomorrow, and I wish you well. Take care.